The moment that didn't make sense every night at exactly 9:17 p.m. As the last diners laughed and lingered over dessert, he noticed a small figure standing just beyond the glow of the restaurant's polished windows. She was always there. Thin jacket, worn shoes, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in patience. He was a millionaire, accustomed to being noticed wherever he went. Yet, she never once looked at him. He watched her servers carried plates of untouched food toward the trash. That was when she stepped forward. No words, no outstretched hand. Just a quiet nod, a soft thank you whispered more into the air than to anyone else. She accepted what others discarded, cradling it like something fragile, something sacred. The contrast hit him hard. Silk tie, gold watch, an child surviving on leftovers. This was his neighborhood, his city, a place he donated to, invested in, bragged about. And yet this girl moved through it unseen, like a ghost everyone had agreed not to acknowledge. He told himself she had parents, that someone else would step in, that this wasn't his responsibility. But every night she returned, smaller than the night before, quieter than the last. What unsettled him most was her dignity. She never ate there, never rushed. She carefully packed the food, checked it twice, then disappeared into the darkness as if following a path only she knew. Around him, people scrolled on phones, argued about politics, complained about service. None of them saw her, or maybe they did, and chose not to. The question followed him home. It sat beside him in the silence of his penthouse, louder than any news channel or market alert. How could a child be this invisible in a city so loud about opportunity? And why did her quiet presence feel like an accusation he couldn't outrun? Something about that silence gnawed at him. It built an empire by noticing patterns others ignored. And now, a question lodged itself in his chest, heavy and insistent. Who was she really? And why did it feel like the answer would expose more than just her story? That single choice would draw a line between who he was and who he could become forever. He didn't know it yet. But the moment he decided to stop watching and start following, everything he believed about success, charity, and innocence was about to collapse. Because when he finally followed her, he had no idea he was about to uncover a truth no amount of money could erase. Two worlds. One, alley he woke each morning. Two, glass and steel. Two numbers that moved at his command. His life ran on schedules, assistants, security codes, and certainty. Meetings began when he said they would. Doors opened before he reached them. Power, he'd learned, was the absence of friction. And for years, he mistook that ease for virtue. By night, the alley told a different story. While his world hummed with control, hers survived on endurance. The little girl returned to the same spot, same hour, same quiet ritual, as if discipline were the only luxury she owned. She did not rush because hunger had taught her patience. She did not beg because dignity had taught her restraint. She stood still while the world stepped around her. He tried to rationalize the discomfort clawing at him. Cities were complicated. Poverty was abstract, something debated on panels and argued in headlines. He funded initiatives. He voted the right way. He shared the right posts. Surely that meant he had done his part. Yet none of that explained why a child needed to wait behind a restaurant for scraps in a city bursting with wealth each night. As he signed receipts and nodded to staff who knew his name, she remained nameless. Invisible labor had built his fortune, invisible hands cooked his meals, and now an invisible child collected what excess left behind. The system worked beautifully. For him, it failed her with brutal consistency. That difference made his certainty fracture slowly. What unsettled him wasn't guilt alone, it was recognition. She navigated scarcity with the same focus he once used to escape it. He remembered the early days, the hunger that sharpened ambition, the promises made to never be powerless again. Somewhere along the way, comfort had replaced conscience. He began watching more closely, not out of charity, but out of unease. He noticed how she inspected each container, how she avoided anything spilled or spoiled, how she protected the food from the cold like it mattered to someone else. This wasn't desperation. This was responsibility. Around them, the city performed its nightly routine. Laughter spilled from bars, cars idled at red lights. People argued about borders, budgets, and who deserved what. Meanwhile, that child carried the weight of survival with more grace than the adults debating her existence. He told himself to look away, to return to his world where problems had distance and solutions came with applause. But curiosity pressed harder each night, braided with a guilt he could no longer dismiss. Because whatever she was doing with that food, it wasn't simple hunger. He told himself it was none of his business. Until he saw what she did with the food, the pattern that haunted him. He began noticing the pattern once he stopped pretending. It was coincidence. Night after night, the girl never lifted a fork, never took a bite, never even paused to taste what hunger had clearly earned. Instead, She crouched beside the dumpster like a careful guardian, sorting containers with deliberate hands. Warm food went together. Bread was wrapped twice. Anything untouched was sealed tight, protected from the cold and the rats and the indifference of the street. She moved quickly, not nervously, but with purpose. When a waiter lingered too long or a passerby slowed their step, she vanished, slipping into the shadows before anyone could ask questions or offer pity. It was as if being seen was the one thing she could not afford. He watched her clutch the bag to her chest, shielding it with her body the way parents shield children. The image followed him. At home, he scrolled through his phone, half expecting to see her face reflected back at him through someone else's outrage. He imagined the comments if this moment ever went viral. How is this possible in a city of billionaires? This is what they mean when they say the system is broken. Everyone arguing, everyone angry, everyone shocked, but never here, never present. He realized how easy it was to care in theory, to demand compassion from a distance. But compassion up close was inconvenient. It asked for attention. It disrupted routines. It refused to be solved with a donation receipt or a trending hashtag. Watching her, he felt exposed, like she was revealing a truth he'd worked hard not to see each night. The same ritual repeated, precise as a clock. Collect, protect, disappear, and the food bag never grew lighter. She carried it carefully, consistently, as though it mattered more to someone else than it did to her. That detail gnawed at him. Children were impulsive. Hunger was urgent, yet she treated those leftovers like a responsibility, not a relief for Ali. Became a mirror, reflecting not her poverty alone, but his comfort, his excuses, and the quiet agreement everyone made to walk past suffering without slowing down or asking who paid the cost. That was when suspicion turned into certainty. This was bigger than a missed meal or a bad week. Bigger than charity. Bigger than luck. And standing there in that alley, watching her disappear into the dark with food she never ate, he finally understood the truth hiding in plain sight. She wasn't taking the food for herself. The decision to follow her, the decision didn't feel heroic, it felt invasive. He stayed back at first, keeping the distance of someone who had spent a lifetime believing privacy was a right money could buy. She walked quickly, cutting through streets tourists never photographed. Each step carried her farther from his world and deeper into one he only knew through statistics and speeches. The lights changed first. Neon gave way to flickering bulbs. Sidewalks cracked. Storefronts were boarded. Their signs faded into languages politicians loved to debate but rarely listened to. He slowed his pace, heart tightening, realizing how unfamiliar this part of the city was to him. He'd funded developments nearby, invested in renewal projects that never seemed to reach streets like these. She never looked back, not once. Her confidence unsettled him. This was not a child wandering aimlessly. This was someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly how little room there was for mistakes. The bag of food swung gently at her side, girded with instinctive care. He wondered how many nights she'd walked this path alone. As they moved deeper, the sounds of the city shifted. Sirens grew distant. Laughter disappeared. Conversations turned into murmurs behind closed doors. He felt eyes on him now, curious, cautious, aware that he did not belong. For the first time in years, his tailored coat felt like a costume, announcing privilege in a place where it carried no protection. His mind raced with justifications. He could stop, call someone, hand her money, walk away. That was always an option for people like him. But something heavier pulled him forward, a need to see the truth through to its end, no matter how uncomfortable it became. Because if he turned back now, he knew he'd spend the rest of his life pretending he never had the chance to look closer. She turned down an alley narrower than the last, where trash fires smoldered and the air smelled of damp concrete and survival. He slowed again, fear tightening his chest, not of her, but of what this place represented. Proof that the system he thrived in didn't just overlook suffering, it depended on its staying hidden. Every step felt like a crossing, from comfort into consequence, from assumptions into reality. He realized he was no longer following her out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. Whatever waited at the end of this walk would either confirm his worst fears or shatter the story he told himself about how fair the world really was. Then she stopped. She stood still beneath a broken streetlight, the bag clenched tighter in her hand, and faced a building that leaned like it was tired of standing. Windows shattered, door hanging loose, a place no child should ever recognize as familiar. And that's when his breath caught, because she stepped forward without hesitation and disappeared inside. The first shocking truth, she slipped through the broken doorway like she had done it 1,000 times before. He stayed outside, hidden by shadow and fear, watching as dim candlelight flickered against cracked walls. Inside, the room came alive in quiet motion. 3 smaller children rushed toward her, their faces lighting up not with greed, but relief. They weren't asking if there was food. They already knew. She knelt, lowering herself to their height, her voice soft, steady, reassuring. The bag opened and the contents were divided with care that felt practiced, almost ceremonial. Portions were measured, bread torn evenly. Nothing. Wise did she made sure the youngest ate first. Not once did she reach for herself. Not once did she hesitate. In that moment, the truth landed with a weight he wasn't prepared for. In the corner of the room, wrapped in thin blankets, lay an elderly woman. Her breathing shallow, her eyes tired but alert. The girl carried a container to her with reverence, helping her sit, waiting patiently as she took slow bites. This wasn't charity. This was family. This was survival organized by a child because no one else had shown up. He felt something in him fracture. All the debates he'd heard about responsibility and deserving suddenly felt hollow. Here was a child carrying the burden of an entire household while a system with endless resources argued about costs. She was the protector. She was the provider. And she had learned these roles not from choice, but from abandonment. The villain wasn't poverty, if it is neglect dressed up as policy. It was a society that praised resilience in children only after forcing them to become resilient too soon. Watching her move between the children and the woman, offering comfort, adjusting blankets, whispering promises she had no way of guaranteeing, he realized how obscene the contrast truly was. His wealth had insulated him from moments like this, from rooms where dignity fought every day just to breathe, from families held together by someone too young to carry the weight. He understood, now that this wasn't about rich versus poor. It was about who the world decided to see, and who it trained itself to ignore. The walls were stained with years of forgetting. The floor was cold. The air carried the quiet ache of lives lived without backup, without headlines, without outrage. This was the cost of indifference, paid nightly by children who learned too early that silence was safer than asking for help. He felt watched by his own conscience, exposed in a way no protest or headline had ever managed to make him feel before, stripped of excuses, comfort, and denial entirely, alone with truth, shaken deeply, profoundly changed inside, beyond return forever now, utterly, permanently altered. Irrevocably. The girl finished distributing the food and finally sat down, her back against the wall, exhaustion settling in. Only then did she take a small bite, careful, restrained, like she was borrowing nourishment she hadn't earned yet. That detail hit him harder than anything else, because just when he thought he understood her sacrifice, he noticed something that broke him, the truth that changed everything. He had expected hardship, he had expected struggle, but he had not expected the rawness of truth. The girl's careful distribution of scraps was not enough. The youngest child's cheeks were hollow. The sick grandmother coughed into thin blankets, each breath rattling, like a warning. This was no fleeting hunger, it was survival under siege, a life tethered to the mercy of leftovers. He realized then what he hadn't allowed himself to consider. She had not eaten properly in days. She had skipped school, every class she could not afford to attend replaced by the labor of sustaining others. Every day she made choices that no child should ever have to make. It wasn't just hunger, it was a system collapsing around them, leaving the smallest, weakest, and most vulnerable to shoulder burdens far beyond their years. He thought of the city he had built, the projects he had funded, the solutions he had praised. He imagined the headlines if they ever saw this reality. How does this happen in a country of billionaires? The imagined social feeds screamed, influencers posting, politicians condemning, reporters covering. Yet none of this would have stopped her grandmother from wasting away in silence tonight. None of it would have protected the children from learning too early that hope often requires impossible sacrifice. The enormity of it pressed against him. Every excuse he had ever told himself that someone else was taking care of it, that charity would fix what policy ignored, that wealth somehow absolved moral responsibility. In a single heartbeat, this was not a story of bad luck. This was a story of systemic neglect. And he had been standing on the outside, observing, deciding whether to intervene. He watched the girl gently soothe the grandmother, placing a hand on her frail shoulder, whispering promises that only a child could make to someone who had seen too many broken ones. She straightened blankets, checked on the other children, and all the while carried herself with a quiet authority born of necessity. She was no longer just surviving, she was commanding survival for others, a hero in a world that refused to acknowledge her existence. In that moment he understood the depth of his own inaction. He had wealth, power, and influence, tools that could have changed lives decades ago, but they had never intersected with this kind of invisible suffering until now. And the choice he faced was clear: remain a distant observer, comfortable in moral abstraction, or step into the unknown and bear the weight of responsibility fully. He swallowed hard. The alley's shadows felt heavier. The quiet of the building pressed in on him. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to return to safety, to preserve the illusions that money could protect him. Yet another part of him, the part that still remembered what it was like to feel powerless, to be unseen, to be unheard, urged him forward, demanded that he act. Then, in the briefest movements, she looked up. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, met his from across the threshold. And in that instant, everything changed. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer just watching. And then, she caught him watching. When their worlds finally collide, she froze. The bag of food clutched tightly to her chest. As he stepped forward, the shadows no longer offered protection. She expected anger, scolding, maybe even punishment for the intrusion she had somehow sensed in the quiet footsteps behind her night after night. Fear sharpened her small features, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain, vulnerable in a way only a child could be. He raised his hands, not in authority, but in surrender, the polished confidence that had carried him through boardrooms, news cycles, and city councils evaporated. There was nothing here to command. No wealth could alter the room's reality. No influence could rewrite the imbalance of lives stretched thin by neglect. For the first time, he had nothing to offer but attention.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice trembling, quiet enough that she could choose to ignore it. He wasn't demanding answers. He was opening himself, unguarded, unshielded. She studied him, eyes wary, searching for deceit. What he was genuine, stripped of ego, stripped of assumptions, stripped of distance. Then she spoke, a small, measured voice that carried years of responsibility far too heavy for her age. She explained the children, the grandmother, the routines, the silence that everyone else had accepted. She did not plead. She did not shame. She merely stated facts, as if speaking clearly might make the world finally see them. He listened, really listened, for the first time in his life. Every statistic, every board meeting, every charitable gesture that had once made him feel absolved now felt hollow compared to the courage and clarity in her words. Humility settled over him, heavier and sharper than any power he had ever wielded. He realized that no amount of money, no reputation, no title could replicate the weight of responsibility she bore silently, every day. In that moment, the central conflict, the imbalance of worlds, of privilege and neglect, of comfort and survival, found its resolution in the simplest form. Understanding, connection, recognition of dignity where society had long refused to look. The alley was no longer just a street, it was a threshold, and crossing it together, with truth laid bare, allowed both worlds to touch for the first time, fragile but undeniable. What he did next didn't just change her life. It sent shockwaves, far beyond that alley. The ripple effects no one expected. Within days, change arrived. Medical attention for the grandmother, food delivered consistently. A small room, clean and safe, replaced the crumbling walls that had been home. School books were stacked, shoes replaced, and a routine of education and care slowly began to take root. The child no longer had to shoulder the weight of survival alone. But the story didn't stay in that alley. Phones recorded, neighbors whispered, social media erupted. Millions imagined themselves in her place, shocked that such suffering could exist unnoticed in a city built on wealth and opportunity. "How can this happen in a country of billionaires?" typed one user. "We have ignored this for too long," commented another. The outrage was immediate, viral, relentless, but it was also catalytic. People donated, volunteered, and demanded accountability from the systems that had allowed this neglect to persist. The millionaire's role transformed. We could have walked away, kept his distance, returned to comfort, satisfied with symbolic gestures. Instead, he engaged with policy advocates, local leaders, and community organizations. He testified at forums, challenged corporate practices, and encouraged others of privilege to act beyond performative charity. His life, once insulated and self-contained, became intertwined with the lives he had long ignored. His empire, built on control and accumulation, now carried responsibility and awareness. Every action rippled outward, touching lives he would never see. Neighborhoods organized support networks. Local schools reached out to vulnerable children. Media outlets spotlighted systemic neglect that had been invisible for decades. A single alley had become a mirror, reflecting what society could achieve when it chose to notice, to care, and to act. And yet, for all the tangible change, for all the visible victories, he realized that the most powerful transformation wasn't in the donations, the houses, or the social outcry. It wasn't in the programs or the policies, or even the lives he had helped protect. But the most powerful change wasn't what he gave. It was what he finally understood. The lesson money can't buy true wealth, he realized, was not measured in dollars, titles, or influence. It was measured in the lives we refuse to ignore, in the courage to see suffering and act, even when it is inconvenient. The little girl had shown him that dignity is earned through care, not granted through circumstance, and that justice begins with recognition, the refusal to turn away. In a country that often equates success with accumulation, he understood that Americanness is not comfort, but responsibility. It is the willingness to lift others, to listen before judging, to place humanity above convenience. He had thought he understood generosity, but she had taught him humility. She had taught him accountability. She had taught him the power of attention, the quiet insistence that every life matters. And in that realization, he found hope. Hope that a single act of witnessing could cascade into change. Hope that compassion, once awakened, cannot be silenced. Hope that the smallest among us can illuminate truths the powerful have long ignored, because, at the end of the day, the greatest lesson he could ever learn, one money could never buy, was simple yet profound. The measure of a life is in the hearts we lift, the injustice we refuse to accept, and the humanity we choose to honor.